everyone. Today we're going to learn about Paleolithic, Neolithic, and River Valley societies. And we're basically going to learn about, in this first part, the origins of human civilization and what people were doing before that. So Homo sapiens, or humans, first emerged in Africa. And you can see on this map probably 150,000 to 100,000 years ago. And then gradually they spread out throughout the world. So in this early time, people were hunter-gatherers or nomadic, which means they moved around based on the season or based on following the herds of animals that they hunted. But at this time, in the Paleolithic period, no one had a permanent village or settlement or anything like that. And so as they followed animal herds and migrated, eventually they spread out throughout the world like you see on the map. So Paleolithic humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They're most important, and when we talk about gathering, they gathered wild plants, berries, fruits, things like that. Their most important discoveries or inventions were they discovered how to make fire, which would be important for warmth and cooking, possibly protection, light, things like that. And then they also learned how to make stone tools. And so on the slide here you see a picture of that. To us, these may not really look like much, but coming up with tools that they could use to grind things or hammer things or anything like that, or for hunting, all of those things were important innovations. And it's also important to remember that the tools and innovations that they created were geographically specific. So if you think about if you lived in Alaska versus the Mediterranean region, say southern Italy, you would have a lot of different needs. You would also have different resources available to you. So in Alaska, one thing that would be really important is finding warm clothing. Your shelters that you erect might look different. So all of those things, in this time period, people are very, very dependent on their environment, and everything they do is pretty much determined by the environment that they're in. There is evidence of art from the Paleolithic period. Cave paintings are an example, like you see here, and they depicted activities of everyday life, like here you see hunting. There was no official government in the Paleolithic period, so people organized into small political groups based around kinship or family, and there is evidence of trade from this period. So even though the people lived in small units and they did not have a government or an economic system, really, there is evidence that people traded as they came into contact with other people to get different resources from places that they did not live. They were also the beginning of spiritual beliefs to explain the world. So two really important terms: animism is the belief in spirits of nature. Shamans are people who are believed to have special abilities to cure the sick or influence the future. So a shaman, or like another term that you may have heard in like a movie or a book or something, would be like a medicine man, like somebody who's thought to have abilities to heal people, to be more in touch with the spirit world than the average person. And there was less socioeconomic separation than in later times. So that means they did not have social classes, and they didn't have this economic distinction between people. And if you think about why that would be the case, it really goes back to their lifestyle. Because if you think about today, what are the things, how do we know, like, if someone is high class or at the bottom of society, all these things? Usually that's determined, even if it's not official, by things like their occupation, like some jobs are viewed as more prestigious than others, and also by money. So we determine where someone is in society, for better or for worse, based on how nice a house they live in, what kind of car do they drive, all these different things. In this time period, none of those things existed. Everybody had the same job, hunter-gatherer, and people didn't have a lot of possessions. So because of that, social classes did not develop yet, simply because there wasn't much to distinguish between different people in society. Now, even though we say they didn't have social classes, and they also didn't really have gender discrimination in the sense that there was more gender equality than in later times, they did have different jobs. So the men hunted and fished and were responsible for defense. The women gathered plants. They were responsible for medicine because a lot of the medicines came from plants, and they were responsible for childcare. And that's really just because the women nursed their babies for longer than a lot of people do now. And so they had to have their children close to them. Now, that's also the reason they gathered instead of hunted, because women had to have their children close, and so it wouldn't be really feasible for them to be like out chasing animals if they're caring for young children. And so that's why they gathered. Now, even though they have separate jobs here, one was not considered better than the other because all of these things are essential to the survival of the society at the time. So eventually we start to have a change, and this is called the Neolithic Revolution. At the end of the last ice age, as the earth warmed up a little bit, agriculture became more possible. And so agriculture was discovered probably by women, since they were the ones gathering plants and dealing with plants. And it would have been discovered by accident. Like eventually somebody realized that when seeds fall to the ground, plants sprout up, and they realized that they could kind of harness that whole thing for their benefit. Once people learn how to farm, for the first time ever, they develop permanent settlements, because no longer do they have to be nomads. If they don't want to be, they can farm, and so they don't have to chase their food, they can grow their food, and then they stay in one place. So the Neolithic Revolution is the change from hunter-gathering to systematic agriculture, which just means planned agriculture, and domestication of animals. And domestication is, these are not wild animals that we're going to chase. We're going to keep them like on a ranch or a farm type situation and raise them for our own benefit. And so farming first developed in Mesopotamia around 8000 BCE. So around 10,000 years ago, it started. People started like really experimenting with it and figuring it out. And domestication of animals began with animals that naturally live in a herd, like goats or sheep, which were easier to domesticate. So here it shows you the core areas of agriculture. The Mesopotamia that I just mentioned is the yellow dot that's located in the Middle East. So agriculture probably started there with plants that already grew wild in that area, such as wheat, barley, and beans, and then spread out throughout the world through cultural diffusion. Now, if you look at this map, there is a place that had to have invented agriculture independently because it was cut off from the rest of the world, which was the Americas. So once people arrived in the Americas, and then you probably learned about the land bridge connecting Asia and the Americas, once they could no longer cross that, the people in the Americas had to develop agriculture independently. So agriculture and the Neolithic Revolution led to a chain reaction that led to civilization. So once we have agriculture, people settle in villages, which grow into cities. The really, really key thing about agriculture is that it allows for a food surplus because it's more productive. So if we are hunter-gatherers, it's unlikely that we're going to get enough food to where we could actually like store food and have a bunch of food left over for the future. We have to constantly be worried about getting food. But if we farm, one person can probably farm and feed like maybe our whole class, 30 people. Okay, and then that frees up everyone else to go do another job, because farming is productive in the sense that not everybody has to be a farmer for the civilization to survive. And so people are freed up to do other things, which is called specialization of labor. Other people are going to specialize in other jobs, which has never been the case before. Once people are specializing and they're producing all these different products, people are going to trade because they want to get things that they don't have in their civilization. And so that's really how agriculture led to civilization. Again, really key thing, it led to surpluses of food, and it led to specialization of labor. So these early civilizations, most of them have these characteristics that you see, and we're going to go through these pretty briefly. It can still be a civilization even if it doesn't have all of these things. So for example, the Incas that you probably have heard about who lived in South America, they never developed a form of writing, but they were a very advanced civilization. So most civilizations will have these things, but it is possible that not everyone does. So early cities and civilizations developed near rivers. They used the rivers, obviously, for water supply, but it also aided transportation and communication. People had to develop systems to control the water because living next to a river, the flow of the water changes depending on the season. If you have a big storm, all these different things can happen. And so people had to develop irrigation to deal with that. Irrigation is a major, major important innovation of the first civilizations. And irrigation could be as simple as just digging a ditch, like you see in the picture, to control where the water goes. But people had to figure that out to make their farming effective. This led to the development of government because they needed to organize people to build all these different irrigation works. So remember, in Paleolithic times when people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, they didn't have a formal government. Maybe sometimes if they needed someone to kind of be in charge, they would look towards the elders of their little group that they traveled with, but they didn't have a need to have an overarching government over them to organize things. Now that people are living in cities, that's going to become really important. So think about it this way. If you're living with just a small group of people and you're traveling around, there's only so many things that can happen that you would have to deal with. If you're now going to have thousands of people living in one place, there's going to be issues. Like things are going to come up that you're going to have to deal with. And so governments organize to control labor, to control storage of food and dispersion of food, and then really important, mediate disputes and keep order. So for the first time, law codes and that kind of thing are going to develop because now so many more people are living in one place together. Many early governments centered around priests, later warriors and kings. So a lot of early governments were tied to religious beliefs, and I'll talk about that. And eventually, they took on more responsibilities, like the things we know them for now. Collecting taxes, making laws, public works, which is like buildings, roads, all the kind of essential things that we use. And somebody now has to be in charge of the military and protect this city or civilization that has been built. In Paleolithic times, we mentioned that people were mostly animist and sometimes believed in shamans. Now, religion becomes more complex. So almost all early religions were polytheistic, and they believed in multiple gods that represented things of nature and controlled human activities. And there's a huge tie in this time period between religion and nature, and that's really because people are still very, very dependent on nature. So even though now they're farming, they're still at the mercy of nature because what if there's a flood? What if there's a drought? All these different things can happen. And so they still feel this very strong connection to nature and wanting nature to kind of cooperate with the life that they're trying to lead. Now that we have specialization of labor, they also developed a priest class, which developed to gain the god's favor through rituals and sacrifices. So as these religions became more complex, they developed rituals or ceremonies to hopefully influence the gods. So these are things that they're going to do that they think are going to make the gods, the god who controls the sun or the god who controls the rain, kind of do what they hope that they'll do so that they'll have a successful farming season. And so the people who came to control these rituals and sacrifices had a special status in society, and they're called priests. Early kings also regarded themselves as gods or representatives of the gods. So a good example of that a lot of people are probably familiar with are the pharaohs of Egypt, who were seen as actual gods themselves living on earth. There is a major exception to this whole idea of polytheism, which is the Hebrews. The Hebrews were the first monotheists, and the religion that developed out of their civilization was Judaism. Religion was also very connected to art and architecture. You're going to see the term monumental architecture. Monumental just means really big buildings. The pyramids of Egypt are an example. It's an example of monumental architecture or really big buildings, but built for a religious purpose. And they were built to house the dead pharaohs because the Egyptians believed you had to have your body embalmed and take all your possessions with you into the afterlife. I mentioned a few minutes ago when we talked about Paleolithic people that they did not have social classes or socioeconomic separation because they just didn't really have anything to delineate them in society. Now that we have specialization of labor, where people have different jobs, people start to become more ranked according to their professions. And this could mean official rankings, like in the caste system in India, which some of you are probably familiar with. It's really, it was like officially enshrined in their civilization. But it could be more informal, like in our civilization today, where we don't say this person is officially a part of this class, but we still kind of look at people, for better or for worse, as being, a certain position in society. And a lot of it is based on job and based on wealth. So examples, the priests, they are higher up because they have the special rituals and they can communicate with the gods. Aristocrats or aristocracy are wealthy landowners. So they own land, and so that gives them status. Warriors had a higher status sometimes. Common people who don't have those things, who just provide labor, and then also slaves. So the elites are the priests, the aristocracy, military leaders, things like that. Almost all of these early civilizations also did have slaves, and slaves were usually people who were captured as prisoners of war. So with job specialization in the arts, people start taking on, like we said, new occupations. An artisan is an important term. An artisan just means people who produce things. A lot of times students look at that like it's an artist, but it doesn't have to be an artist. It's just anybody who makes things. So like bricklayers, blacksmiths, weavers. And for the first time, people move past possessions that are purely for survival to luxury items. So in the Paleolithic times, people are moving around and they're really just taking the stuff that they need for survival. And so they didn't even really develop a lot of other items. Now that we have people in society who have different levels of money, one of the ways that you can show that off is through your possessions. And so there's a demand for all different types of products to be produced. People also start using metals. So in the Paleolithic times, people used stone tools. Now they start using metals, bronze, which is a mixture of metals, and then iron. And then again, monumental architecture in this time period was often tied to religion, and that comes about because of job specialization as well. So writing was probably first used by priests to record religious rituals, or by the government perhaps. The earliest writing used pictographs, where different pictures represented each word, and later they kind of transitioned into symbols and then sounds, kind of like we have our alphabet today. Scribes were an important job. Scribes were people who were specially trained to read and write and record information for the government or for a religious group. So they would record things about religion, trade, or government activity. The reason this was a specialized job is because in these early writing systems before they had an alphabet, there were thousands of symbols you had to learn. And so that's something that not everybody, very few people are going to spend the time to do. And so being a scribe was a high-class position. So that was one of those occupations that could distinguish you. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia, which you see in the bottom left, was considered the first writing system. The first alphabet was developed later by the Phoenicians in the Middle East. You also see Egyptian hieroglyphics. That's an example of the pictograph writing where you have pictures for different words. All of these new civilizations had a big impact on the environment. So soil erosion is an example. This occurred from farming and from grazing animals because people were removing the natural vegetation. So if you're going to have a farm, you need to clear the land, chop down all the trees, etc. And so then there's not as much to hold the soil in place. And so if it rains, that soil can just run off. The same thing is true with grazing animals. So if the animals eat too much of the vegetation, the soil can be disrupted by a rain. Other problems that would occur with intensive farming over time, soil depletion. So I'm sure a lot of you know about that, but you can't plant the same crop in the same field over and over and over, and it's eventually not going to be productive anymore because the nutrients are depleted in the soil. And then deforestation would be another one, because people are chopping down trees to convert land to farming. All right, it's important to remember that not everybody got on board with the Neolithic Revolution. So we can't just assume, oh, farming was discovered, and so everybody just went and became a farmer. There were people who were made nomadic for thousands of years. We call these people pastoral nomads. So a pastoral nomad is someone who's an animal herder who moves around to find food for their animals. An example of a nomadic group that lasted way after this is the Mongols that we're going to learn about this year. These people were important transmitters of early technology. Because they moved around and they visited different civilizations over time, they helped with cultural diffusion. Because if they see something or maybe learn about a religion or something like that in one civilization, and then they go somewhere else, that they can spread that information. And so on the next section of this lecture, you're going to learn about the first early civilizations. So I told you how civilizations developed, but now we're going to look at some specific examples. And you can see they are ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia and the Middle East, the Indus River Valley in India, and the first civilization in China. So I will see you next time.